I would like to welcome all of you to Rumi Forum to listen to a very special guest today, Qamar Al-Huda. My name is Ayşe Kadayıfçı Orayana, and I am an adjunct faculty at the American University and Associate Director of Salam Institute for Peace and Justice. And I have had the honor of working with Qamar Al-Huda during the last couple of years, and it's a pleasure and honor for me to introduce him today. Qamar Al-Huda is a senior program officer in the Religion and Peacemaking program at United States Institute of Peace. His specialty is in Middle East and Islamic history, Islamic ethics, religion, violence, conflict, and specifically nonviolence in Islam. Tonight he'll be talking to us about his recent edited book entitled The Crescent and the Dove, Peace and Conflict Resolution in Islam. This book provides a critical analysis of nonviolent strategies and peace-building efforts in the Muslim communities. So I would like to present Qamar to you to talk about his book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for Rumi Forum for hosting me and everyone here taking their time to listen to the discussion. I just wanted to say a first preliminary few words of the book, The Crescent and Dove, Peace and Conflict Resolution in Islam, and how it manifested itself, what's its origins, and why it's there and timely. Just also some words about how it fits into the field of conflict resolution. About 3 years ago, we invited 25 scholars and practitioners to talk about violence and nonviolence in Islam. And they were legal scholars, they were historians and sociologists, they were, of course, lawyers, human rights lawyers. There were also practitioners, so NGOs, women who had NGOs in peace education, NGOs that still run youth engagement. And essentially we try to have an interdisciplinary conversation on how to reframe the current debate of violence in Islam, non-violence Islam, is there space for non-violence, and what to do to move ahead, to move it beyond the jihad conversation. Clearly in the beginning of our conversation, all the scholars always started, at least there was a camp of legalists, a jurist, who's always started with the rules of engagement. Mm-hmm. That violence is not something, and they gave the legal interpretation. Historically, violence has its place, but there's limitations of violence. And then others who contested that this legal interpretation was overly emphasized in Islam. And there's many perspectives outside of the legal world, philosophy, theology, sociologists, and so forth. A new crop of authorities who say, there's all these other nonviolent actions that we should contemplate. So I think the book captures this tension of a Muslim debate that's going on, and a conversation that's not really heard outside of this internal debate inside the Muslim house, quote unquote, of scholars and NGOs and human rights and secularists and religious leaders and so forth. This debate of rethinking of the tradition, rethinking of it vis-a-vis modern questions, modernity, and all these changes in the Islamic world. So that's one part of it. But what we found is that when you try to situate what is peace and conflict resolution in Islam within the larger field of Islam, conflict resolution, we found that there was resistance, because the field is filled with a very humanist approach, meaning that it didn't have religious approaches and themes to conflict resolution. So we have human rights approaches, we have secular approaches, some cultural approaches. But when it came to thinking about religion, religious actors who can also be members of the field and participate in conflict resolution, we saw a push and pull in the larger field. So this book also contests that framework, that there is something called religious peacemaking within the field of conflict resolution. And they have a niche. And that niche needs to be acknowledged, at least studied and understood, and see what they're doing. There's also another issue the book is contesting, that within those scholars in the Western world, when they have come to study religion, if you look in the 80s, or even before the 80s, there was this discussion that religion will disappear. It will be not really significant in the world stage. And then in 1979, you had the Iran Revolution, you had the awful problems of Jonestown in Guyana, you had other religious resurgence in other places. You had the president of Egypt assassinated by the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you had scholars now studying religion, but studying religion as a fundamentalist phenomenon. That religion is coming back, but in political form, political aspirations. And so these scholars, a lot of scholars, start examining religion only through the lens of its political activities and its ability to be active with only political aspirations. That is tied to another conversation that was a natural conversation in the 90s, which is to see religion as a source of conflict. That I recall almost several conversations in the class at Georgetown. Many students assume that if you take about 75 current conflicts in the world, or nascent conflicts, ask students how many of these conflicts are religiously based, almost all of them said about 90% of them. Assuming that all these conflicts around the world have some religious actors inciting hatred, stereotypes, or conflict. But the truth is, there's less than 5 or 6 that has some religious-based conflicts. So there's this another tension that the book is contesting, which is when religion is studied, it's always studying as a source of problem, adding to conflict, contributing to violence. Again, so those are the sort of the assumptions we're contesting. The authors, in this backdrop, we said, let's take another turn. If we're just going to move into religious peacemaking, but direct it towards Islam and study Islam specifically, what is it that Muslim NGOs, Muslim scholars, religious scholars, academics, media, so forth, what do they do on daily, average persons, what do they do on a day-to-day basis that inspires them to resolve conflict and disputes non-violently? And I would say the vast majority of Muslims are inspired, who are religious, are inspired by religious teachings. And so that's what the book uncovers. That what are those teachings of forgiveness, of social justice, of civic duties, of trying to keep harmonious relationships, etc., etc.
You mentioned that the field of conflict resolution, there is a developed human rights approach, a secular approach. Do we really need this Islam and peace approach? How does it differ in terms of the secular approach? Do we really need to bring religion into? How do you react to that? Do you ever get asked questions like that?
No, yes, that's a common question. In fact, one of the chapters addresses human rights within Islam, and that chapter and other chapters talk about, well, the vast majority of the field, if you look at peacemaking and peace building, whether through the UN or other Western NGOs and Eastern NGOs, are operating within a secular approach. In order to have peace, you work on development, and development includes X, Y, Z. And this is working for, let's say, the major NGOs or international organizations. However, while there are many, many Muslims who believe in that perspective, and that's what the book captures, that there are a group of scholars who say, if you bring religion in, you'll complicate peace building, you'll complicate conflict resolution, so don't bring it in. We're very comfortable with its distance. The only thing is it ignores the fact that on the grassroots, around the world, in different Muslim communities, essentially these communities are still religious, are very devout. And you see public faith. So how can you not include it? How can you ignore that? How can you ignore the core principles of what people identify with? And so that's the counter argument by some of the other scholars in the book. And I think that's what we're trying to also capture is this tension. There's no homogeneous perspective. This is Islamic peacemaking. This is the formula. We're trying to show that there's a diversity. And I think it comes with a diversity of Islam, what they mean by Islam. Some of the scholars have said that for me, Islam is a civilization. It's my culture. It's various cultures in this tradition. And so it's not religious. And if religious is a personal faith, and it should be kept personal. Others have said Islam is primarily religious, and there's some cultural habits to it, but it's primarily religious. And all these other cultural habits and civilizations, that's secondary. And so it depends on who you're speaking to and how they define their tradition. And then that drives the definitions.
You mentioned one chapter was on human rights in Islam. What are the other themes that the book explores more specifically?
Well, first it goes directly into the multiple interpretations of peace and conflict. That peace is historically within the Islamic world, either by philosophers, theologians, historians, astronomers, etc. They all had a sense that peace was a multidimensional thing. It wasn't just something you can capture, and it's a lack of violence, of course. It was something deeper. And so that chapter talks about sort of the metaphysical and the spiritual dimensions, the philosophical dimensions, but also it's beyond just the lack of violence or of real violence. The other chapter that I think that's very interesting, and we attacked it very early in the book, which is this whole concept of when you speak about violence in Islam, ultimately you have to deal with the term jihad and its connotations. Its connotations in the West is obviously that's the holy war. Its connotations in some other Muslim communities, of course, it's holy war too, by some radicals. However, in between these two ends, there's a big pendulum, and it deals with the multiple definitions of jihad and how it evolved in just the first century of Islam, and what it had different meanings in the Quran, and how those different meanings evolved. So different state actors used it for state purposes. Social actors took it and meant to mean this. So that chapter deals with jihad, meaning literally means struggle. So there's an intellectual struggle, there's a spiritual struggle, there's a service struggle, there's a struggle to purify yourself, a struggle to serve others in the community. But the last struggle, which somehow moved to the very first definition in modern times, which is a struggle to defend yourself if you're under attack. And only then it has to be mandated by the state. A state determines these things, and only state officials can determine when it's time to fight to defend its borders or the acts of aggression. All of that, I think the chapter deals with violence in a way it was misused and misappropriated and over the years. The other chapters I think are very interesting is this new phenomenon in the past 15 to 18 years, which is peace education. That's having roots in various schools, in private schools, in Islamic schools, meaning Islamic seminaries, public schools, and a lot of it's driven by NGOs who really feel that there's a lack in the current curriculum in different predominant Muslim countries of having today's students think about peace critically, think about conflict critically, and then having techniques to deal with conflict. So peace education from all the way from Morocco to Sub-Saharan to Indonesia to various parts of the Middle East. This peace education chapter concentrates on Indonesia, but it shows you how it developed and how the challenges of implementing a peace education program that involves working with religious leaders. So you don't exclude them, but you include them in the process, and then in that process you have perspectives within an Islamic framework. So peace education is what within the field of conflict resolution is an established field. It's massive. But I think what we've seen in the Islamic world, that it's really becoming an important subject for faculty members to be trained in, new textbooks, new curricula, and so forth. So that's one subject that it covers. And lastly, I think what I have to mention is this field that we think that needs more exploration is the idea of women. Yes, women in conflict, particularly Muslim women. We found in chapters that in conflict zones, women do not take a back seat to conflict, and they're not in the home while conflict is happening. But the way conflict unfolds itself, all members of society have a role and have a stake in mitigating and reducing this conflict. So we find that in 3 cases at least, Muslim women are extremely important in the front of resolving conflict. From Thailand is one case study, Afghanistan, and Kenya. And there are references to other places too, Nigeria, Palestine, and Iraq. But the 3 studies are documented how women are extremely important in dealing with continuing education for students, for refugees, continuing services, trying to get medical help and aid to refugees or to displaced persons, working with officials so they understand the situation on the ground, informing religious leaders of what they need to do to organize themselves to resolve this conflict. And so we find in all 3 cases, women are extremely important as being a voice, but also important players in negotiating a resolution to conflict.
Thank you. You have been going around talking about your book. What were some of the reactions that you've been receiving? And are there any differences between the reactions you received from the Muslims and non-Muslims?
Yeah, I find that some people are skeptical that this book is apologetic and is trying to show and paint Islam in a rosy picture. And I think because the cover is very nice, they think that's what I'm doing. But actually, it's a very hard look at and critical look at things that are working and not working. So it doesn't paint the tradition rosy. All of these essays are very self-critical, shows the issues at hand. So it's not apologetic. So second, a lot of people think, oh, then this book shows and demonstrates there are moderate Muslims out there. So great, we should support these moderate Muslims. And again, I suggest that the vast majority of Muslims are not interested in violence, but I don't know if the moderate is the right term. But if you do stick with the term, it has some implications in policy implications. It has implications of within certain cultures. Moderate may mean someone who's too liberal. It may mean to someone who compromises his or her traditions. It may mean someone who is not invested in that tradition, but somehow has a watered down version of it. So moderate can have its own interpretations in different cultures, so I wouldn't suggest to use that. Again, I was just, so I say, if you read the book, you'll see that it's just uncovering what's already out there. Some Muslim reactions is, okay, we know some of this, but why put it within a conflict resolution framework? Why can't you just have Islam and peace? Because, and my response is that because many of these principles that help Muslims and all human beings to harmonize relationships, to resolve conflicts on a daily basis, they are operating in a way to resolve these disputes, and they have some principles that's pushing them to think that way. So we know as a person that, okay, this works with my wife or my husband or my partner and so forth, that we know that we can't live in a certain amount of tension. I cannot keep on hitting my pet all the time and subordinate it and think that, okay, you've received loyalty and complete affections. But if you uncover it, you realize it's just false. I mean, it may be subordinate, but it doesn't have your affection. So the point is that we don't operate that way. We want to operate in ways that makes our affections and cognitive thinking are very in line and aligned. So that's why it's in a conflict resolution framework.
Okay. Thank you. And finally, what's next? How does this book could be helpful to practitioners on the ground who would be interested in working with Muslims in the Muslim world on conflict resolution and peace building? How can it be helpful to policymakers, for example? How do you see this book impacting in a longer term?
Yeah. Well, I think we have a set of nine recommendations for policymakers and thinkers who think about what people can do into different Muslim communities, and based on our own research and based on those who contributed to the book. So, one of the first suggestions that come to my mind is that there cannot be a cookie cutter approach to dealing with different Muslim communities. What may work for operating in Turkey or in Egypt or in Morocco is not the same, or may not be the same. There may be similar patterns and trends, but we can't think it's the same. Second is, sometimes from what I hear from policymakers in the past 9.5 years, is that with religious leaders, if we can just correct or realign certain religious leaders, then there'll be a trickle-down effect into the mosque, into the community. So we just need to get religious leaders who speak extremist ideology, who are extremely who are open to radical thought and so forth, or perhaps anti-Western. If we just tame them down, we will help them. And this book addresses that you can't treat religious leaders as people with no brains. I mean, they are operating in such a way that they know you want something, and they know they can provide something. They understand the whole relationship of supply and demand. So one, it is to how to deal with religious leaders, what is their context, what is the history of their position with the state and their communities. So we have a chapter that deals with not to reinvent the tradition for religious leaders. Bring them into the conversation, have a conversation, take an assessment, take a needs assessment of what is going on, and maybe there's something to change here, something that is not to change here. So I think that has to be taken in consideration. I think policymakers, educationists, scholars, students of U.S. Muslim relations, and even others who are just interested in what is conflict resolution principles in Muslim communities. I think this book provides a great deal of a window to what is happening and what is being thought of in around Muslim communities, and what are the key issues that Muslims are discussing and facing, and the various divergent views on conflict and conflict resolution. And there's no set of a consensus. For instance, we have two scholars who are Shiites, and several are Sunnis, and some have Sufi orientations, and so this combination helps in presenting those views.
Did you face any challenges in the process, or was it no? Any lessons learned?
Well, there's challenges. Well, it was challenging to get a book published, I must say that.
That's it.
But I would say the challenge is also trying to keep the dialogue within the framework of violence and nonviolence, and how could we keep authors to think along those questions? That's the challenge. Sometimes people have a lot to say about a subject, but it's not within the framework of conflict resolution. So there's chapters that deal with nonviolent characters. So for instance, we wanted to highlight in one chapter who would be considered the Muslim Gandhi. And we find this a problem, an interesting problem in the classroom. When you ask that to students, whether it be in the States or Europe or in Muslim, it's many people just don't know who they can't identify it. So one chapter focuses on one particular Turkish nonviolent figure, Said Nursi, and it's just to raise questions of how this person was driven to be a nonviolent activist and scholar in very difficult circumstances, but also to raise a larger question is why is it problematic to find and identify nonviolent actors in the Muslim world when there's so many? So that was one of the challenges, that even within the community of writers, I'm not sure if they felt they were pressed or they couldn't identify one or two, but there's so many that it's hard. And then to even divide it as men and women, different cultures. I mean, each culture has their own set of nonviolent actors. So that was the challenges.
Okay. Maybe we can now open the floor for the audiences. Yes, please. And if you could introduce yourself.
I'm very encouraged when you say that there's peace education that's being done on a very deliberate scale. And I was wondering if there was also education about other religions, because I think a lot of misunderstanding stems from just basic ignorance about what the religion really teaches each other. For example, in conjunction with the peace education, is there any piece of that really tells people what Christians believe Jesus to be about on a nonviolent level? And I think I'm really concerned, when you hear things like the extremists, recently blew up a big Catholic church, and then some other move in Pakistan to penalize a Christian woman who's a blasphemer and killer. I mean, so I'm wondering if, as part of the peace education, if there's also, not at a theological level, but just basic what Christian, because the temptation is obviously to say that what the government is doing is a reflection on all the religion, which is fueling some of the counter violence, right? I mean, the government doesn't speak for any religion. The government speaks for a particular political point of view, right?
Yeah.
Qamar?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. From my own work, and this is the work I'm working on, I've studied about 22 different countries that have peace education programs as we speak, 22 Muslim majority countries. And they are operating mainly from the NGO world. So sometimes they are working in the public schools, or sometimes they're working in the private schools. And private schools are schools that are taught in the English medium, English or another language, French or so. And then they vary from middle school to high school to college level. So my point being is that even though 22 different Muslim communities from various parts of the world have peace education and it's being actively taught, it's still at a level that it's not at top down. So you don't have ministries of education saying peace education is mandatory, and we will have this taught from kindergarten to 12. Right now there's a sort of randomness to it, and I'm not sure if we've actually uncovered some of its outcomes as we speak. I mean, although it's just unfolding. I've studied all the different manuals being used, and some of the manuals do include world religions section. Most of them do include religious minorities and the differences, how to tolerate and how to understand, techniques to understand. But since a lot of the peace education programs are coming from, let's say, basic Western models, or somewhere is amalgamation of Islamic models, and somewhere in the middle somewhere, it depends which country that has these world religions that are taught. I mean, when extremists do those things that you describe with churches and statements against Christians and so forth and other minorities, I mean, by the time someone acts that way, peace education is not directed towards that person. Unfortunately, peace education is a preventative measure for particular type of schools that are still just experimenting with it. And there's a lot of issues with peace education, just the field itself. That's the way it's taught, where it's taught. Sometimes it's a supplemental course, sometimes it's a course that has no credit. So even though the school is suggesting we have this course, sometimes you don't have the right enrollment So it's not just in Muslim world, but it's all around the world. Peace education has its challenges. But the silver lining is that it's there. It just needs to be more funded, I think. And I think it needs to be more systematic. And it would be we suggested in the book that perhaps the OIC, the Organization for Islamic Conference, or any other international body that can organize a meeting of ministries of educators and the Ministry of Educations of different countries to really take this issue head on and make it mandatory. The only country I know that makes peace education mandatory is Philippines, with a presidential order about 2 years ago. And so they're reorganizing the whole education curriculum, and they have a whole peace education staff in various districts. So it's rearranging the whole system. And it would be beneficial not just for Muslim majority countries, but I would say Western countries too, to have this, given that there's a problem of violence.
Yes.
One question is, when you started out speaking, I thought it might be interesting to look at the history of diplomacy in Islamic civilizations, right? This is a sort of high-profile political peacekeeping, and could you look at sort of traditions, the way that Islamic diplomats over time have handled this, and if they're drawing on religious resources? I don't know if that's included in your book, but that'd certainly be an interesting thing to look at. Also, it was hard not to think of what happened in Iran, where you have a very violent regime, and the people had peaceful protests and were sort of put down. And they're very brave about it. I mean, they weren't attacking back, and they sort of looked like nonviolent resistance, to a great extent. What's in their minds when they're doing that? I mean, some of the people, I think, are they're reformists, but they're Islamic. Some of them are interested in having a secular government, and so maybe they have a Western notion of nonviolence. And I just thought, what do you say about that? Who are those people? Why are they? How can they resist peacefully against that regime? Where is that coming from? So two questions.
Yeah, that's a good question. The first one, I don't know if our essays dealt historically in the diplomacy part of it, but that's something we should look into. And I'm not sure if I know of a historian that deals with Muslim diplomacy in the pre-modern period, but that's something to think about. The piece that we opened with was with really the multiple definitions of peace by various important scholars, both men and women, throughout time, just to show you that there is a comprehensive understanding of peace that could add to the conflict resolution definitions of peace that we have in the field. Yes, I would add that not only in terms of the question on Iran, that there have been several nonviolent social movements that unfolded in front of us. One, of course, is the Green Movement. One, of course, in Pakistan, the lawyers' movement that was against President Musharraf. And in this case that the other speaker spoke about the church in Iraq, the way the local Muslim community intervened to help negotiate with in saving the rest of the hostages, and to resist the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. In a way, they helped Christians get to the hospitals to get immediate help and so forth. I mean, it's just there's a lot of work that's unfolding and working as we see. And I think that's what we're touching on, and how people are operating. It's an amalgamation of culture. It's an amalgamation of their professional ethics. It's a combination of their own religious teachings, cultural teachings. It's certain foundations of that society that says when the state oppresses you, maybe out of survival, you don't need to always fight back with a fist and with arms. that there is historical precedence of becoming victorious if you do it nonviolently, if you work nonviolently. And there's also methods and methodologies and approaches that we have already that we could utilize. It's a matter of thinking about it. Many people today would say, oh, in Iran or in Palestine, the nonviolence movement is dead. You don't see it, but it's present. It's just not always publicly manifested. You see a lot of people talking about it, thinking about it, next steps, networking. There's several ways to resist boycotts and so forth that happens on a daily basis. And I think in Iran specifically, you see the Green Movement not in the public, but from what I understand, what I'm told, there's a lot of underground organization work that's happening. And the fact that the clergy is involved with many of this movement, still involved, shows us that the clergy has some influence on the thinking of it, but it's not clergy driven. You know?
Okay. Yes, you had your hand before.
My name is King Boynton, and I have an interesting job working on another kind of a conflict. I'm an engineer and also an aquatic ecologist. You mentioned a moment ago that you had 9 recommendations. Would you give us a summary of those, please?
Sure. It's collaborative effort on some of these recommendations. I'll just give you the few that stand out first. And so these recommendations are not just mine, but from the authors. And in order to support more true engagement within the Muslim world, in the context of what to do within all these tensions, first we suggested is human security. I mean, when whoever is able to support human security and economic security, this is the first and foremost important thing that's going to support local civil society actors to continue their work in the conflict resolution paradigm. Without that, it's almost very problematic. You have oppressed, very strong authoritarian states without the freedom of basic rights. It's a strong tension there. So that was another suggestion, was to have systems open up for people to express themselves. We also suggested a religious engagement to be taken seriously by our Western diplomatic corps. Most of our foreign service officers here in the West are afraid of religious people in one way or another. Afraid in the sense that you shouldn't connect state and church. And we're so programmed to think that way that when you're in the field with other societies where religion is so profoundly important, they're unable to manage that issue. So we suggest that religious engagement be something taken seriously and actually be taught in their training. We also suggested a rethinking of all education systems. Muslim schools, seminary schools, which are usually on the fringes of a Muslim society, and some societies, not all, and try to reintegrate them, whether they be madrasas in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or pasantrans in Indonesia. They're left to themselves to be so independent to a point where the state really has no sense of how they're operating, what's being taught, what these students can do after their training. So we suggested that there should be some sort of real assessment of integrating these schools So students will have more than just religious studies teachings, but also include other topics like social studies and humanities and literature and so forth and sciences. We also suggested, even though there's this worldwide economic crisis, that there should be some sort of attention paid to the poorest of these countries and supporting some sort of debt relief to some of these countries. We also supported conflict resolution programs to be, as well as peace education programs to be taught at almost every level of the school, not at college level, wait to college level, but K to 12 and then college and up. So those are some of the suggestions and recommendations.
Okay. The lady behind, yes, please.
My name is Tamara Slater. I work at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And we actually do sort of a lot of what you just mentioned about religious diplomacy and working with, specifically I work with the madrasas in Pakistan, and I was very curious to hear you speak a little bit more about the way that you feel your work with conflict resolution within the Islamic framework, how that has fit into the broader conflict resolution field, how you've been reacted to. I mean, you sort of hinted at it, that it's a little difficult to get people involved in conflict resolution to respect the role of religion. So a little bit about the response that you've got, and maybe some examples that you've seen where religion is actually an essential piece of the conflict resolution process. Thank you.
Sure. And a lot of our work, whether it be in Afghanistan, Pakistan, in madrasas or outside of madrasas, or in Egypt, Jordan, Nigeria, wherever we're working with religious leaders, and when we work with them, what I really mean is that we support their role and what they do, and trying to make them think about what is their role in resolving a conflict. Can they see the conflict and ask them what is their role in resolving this? Many religious leaders, I tell you, one will say, this is not our problem. This is the fault of the state. The state's collapsed. It's a failed state. It's not my problem. I have to just worry about my congregation. I have to worry about my community. So, but that's not the majority. Actually, the majority of religious leaders, scholars, and thinkers would say, okay, what do we do? I mean, we have a state that's independent on a state. So, and it's dependent on Western policies and so forth. So, but when you do push them a little further and say, instead of thinking about these larger issues of the state and larger interstate issues, Iraq and Afghanistan, think about you and your community and what you can do in your institution. That's where we get the best reaction, because then they're forced to think not in these macro but micro level, the personal, interpersonal, community. Because when they do think of conflict, unfortunately they think of big conflicts, the conflicts that make the news. That's sometimes not even in their own state, in their own region. So you can be speaking to someone in Indonesia and they're speaking about Palestine and Israel, like they're part of it. Or you speak in Nigeria and they're very much so passionate about what's happening in Iraq. And I say, okay, if you can pass that and think about conflict as just a definition of where it is incompatible interests, incompatible agendas, what is happening in your schools, what is happening in your communities, what is happening between you and the pastor and the other, and let's say the Christian tradition, or a Jewish tradition, or a Hindu tradition, the Sikhs or Buddhist. I mean, what sort of ongoing systematic dialogues do you have? And some of our reactions has been, well, what do we need this for? And some others eventually learn that there's a lot of benefit to do that, to have this this relationship and to have a coalition. Other times we found, both in Palestine, Israel, as well as in Iraq, that religious leaders want more techniques, more skills. That's been the bottom dollar. That they're very much interested in, how do we mediate? What sort of skills do you need to mediate? What does it mean to be a better facilitator? What does the sustainable dialogue mean? And how do we further use that in our community? So what we're seeing is that there's a desire, once they're exposed to these different things and different aspects of conflict resolution, they want more of it. But they want to tweak it so it's within their own cultural and religious framework.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman there.
My name is Suleiman Wasti. I'm a fan of the Rumi Forum. Sorry, I was late and I missed the earlier part of your presentation. One of the negative repercussions of Clash of Civilizations by Huntington was that religions assumed an East-West divide.
Yeah.
That Christianity being a Christian religion and the others being from the Middle East and beyond. And unfortunately today, like, you have rapid decline of Christian populations in Iraq and Lebanon, North Africa, and Christianity being, considered to be a Western religion. Now, does your book contend with this issue of geographical divide and how to overcome all these obstacles? I mean, there is nothing, all the monotheist religions had the Middle East roots, so one has to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Yes.
There is a chapter on clash of civilizations and addressing whether that clash has any substance and how that plays into Islamic communities. It doesn't spend a great deal of time on discussing the other theories tied to that. But I think what the article then does is move into the economic implications of these tensions. So instead of seeing it as a religious divide, seeing it as economic and resource issue, and seeing its resource issue as a primary factor to the conflicts of particular regions. It doesn't say, nor does it address what to do with the problem with the Christian minorities who are leaving their particular communities or being forced out or being attacked. But it does deal with certain Muslim scholars, like in Nigeria and in Palestine, who have engaged with real dialogue and how they benefited from those dialogue. So we have some sections dealing with a Muslim sheikh talking to a Jewish settler, and what are those discussions? What have that led to? We have some discussion of a Muslim imam and pastor in Nigeria, and what are those discussions led to after massive rioting and killings in the mid-90s and late 90s, and also in the last year in Nigeria. But it doesn't frame it and couch it within the clash, but more in resources, development issues, and issues of economic.
I think we have time for one more brief question and brief answer. You had your hand, sir.
Glenn Strait. When I hear peace and conflict resolution in Islam, I tend to think you're talking about between Muslims, within the Muslim community. And I assume that, the conceptual framework of you are my Muslim brother makes a very different context for conflict resolution than you are not my Muslim brother. And I'm interested in this issue as it would relate to Palestine, where some Palestinians are very, serious practicing Muslims, and you've got secular factions as well, and so you've got factions within the Palestinians that, need to resolve their own conflicts.
Very briefly, come on.
Try to understand the question is, yes, I mean, I think I try to highlight that the tensions within the Muslim world, as well as encapsulated in the book, is that it's not only a Muslim who is a devout, pious Muslim. Their understanding of conflict resolution and working within the Islamic tradition is clear. And we highlight how they conceive of those principles. But we also highlight the fact that they are secular Muslims. And what do they use in terms of their framework? And this tension between one and the other that doesn't necessarily mean that the operations is not fruitful, but just to show you that there are divergent approaches. So it puts some people uncomfortably because they think Islamic peacemaking should be only religious, and we're trying to expand the definition, that is, non-religious dimensions to it. And within Palestine, I think it's evident more than anywhere. You have the Fatah and you have the Hamas group, and they both have different visions of their society. Not necessarily conflict resolution driven, but they have different visions of what that society should be. And I think that's probably a nice example of what I was trying to refer to.
I would like to thank all of you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but maybe we can continue afterwards. Thank you so much for an engaged discussion, and always a pleasure to hear you, Qamar. And also, I would like to thank Rumi Forum for organizing and hosting this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.